I invite you to remain standing for our scripture reading. We'll be reading from Psalm 24, verses 1 and 2. Let's read God's good word together. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants too, because God is the one who established it on the seas. God set it firmly on the waters. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. The Gospel of Mark tells a story of a woman who came to Jesus and began washing his feet with her tears. And the disciples, presumably, I'm reading into the story a little bit, but only a little bit. They're like, okay, move on, leave him alone. This is kind of weird. And Jesus said, leave her alone. She's done what she could. Wouldn't that be a cool thing to put on your tombstone? Like, leave Brandon alone. He has done what he's could. And he's done now. Let him rest. That's what Ruth Haley Barton says she wants to have on her tombstone. She struggles with, she's a spirituality writer and struggles with trying to get it all done and knowing when it's enough. And she was joking about that to her spiritual director. And her spiritual director said, do you ever think you try to do more than you can do? And it was a joke, but she did not laugh because it hit a little too close to home. Do you ever feel like that's what you're trying to do? You're trying to do a little bit more than you actually can. It seems like that's the trajectory of a lot of our lives. We're trying to do more and keep up with more and more streams of communication. And I know I got that information somewhere. I just can't remember. Was it an email? Was it a text? Was it a remind thing? Was it a conversation? It's around here somewhere, and we're trying to keep track of it all. And we feel this pressure to use technology to multiply our productivity so that we can achieve more than we ever dreamed about, more than our grandparents even could have comprehended, and just to be more and more. And we find ourselves more and more overwhelmed with just trying to keep up, just trying to do it all. And I don't know about you, I could use a little bit more simplicity in my life. And so that's what we're going to look at today. How can we simply live? And so we're looking at life in the wilderness. Our sermon series for these 4 weeks is Surviving the Wilderness, Leaving Comfort to Find Life. And last fall, I spent 2 weeks in the wilderness of Utah with a wool blanket, a knife, an army poncho, and not a lot else. And I'm going to be sharing about those experiences and what I learned from them. And we're also looking at what the Bible tells us, the wilderness stories of the Bible and how we can learn. And one of the things that you experience in the wilderness is that life gets really simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. Like, okay, I'm out of water. I have to find more water or else it's going to be bad, right? I mean, it doesn't get a lot more simple than that. It's 100 degrees and I'm in the desert and in the sun. I've got to find some shade or else it's going to be bad, right? I mean, just a lot of really simple things and all the other stuff. Did I reply to that email? You know, I did not worry about that while I was there. And it just gets really simple. And so that's what we're looking at today. And really why we're doing this series is we all find ourselves in the wilderness eventually. Probably for most of us in this day and age, if you live in the suburbs, you're not finding yourself in a literal wilderness unless you do like I did and sign up for an outdoor survival school. But we all face those wildernesses whenever we experience something where the things that we've depended on are taken from us. And we've got to figure out how we're going to continue moving on. Whenever there's somebody that we count on that relationship falters, or we lose someone, or we have a job and that's where we derive our identity and suddenly we don't have that anymore. We lose it or we retire. We've got to figure those things out. We all find ourselves in those wilderness moments at one time or another. And the wilderness can be powerful. One of the things that we find is that if we can open ourselves to encounter God, that encounter will stay with us forever. The things that we experience there will stay with us. We'll carry those with us. It's not just getting through it so we can forget about it, but we have to be able to open ourselves because it can also be a place of suffering. And so where we started was we looked at Jesus spending 40 days in the desert. After he was baptized, the first thing that we see him do as an adult, he's baptized, and then he immediately goes into the wilderness to prepare for the ministry that he would do, the teachings and the healings and driving out demons and facing his role as the Savior, as the Messiah. And he knew better than to just go into that without preparing. And so he spent 40 days fasting and praying in order to prepare for that, so that whenever he was tempted, and he was, that he could resist. And so he got really clear about that in the desert. And one of the things that we talked about last week is that the practice of fasting is something that is really fallen out of practice for most Christians today, at least in the West, in the U.S. But fasting can help us realize what's really driving us. What is really motivating me? Whenever we take that food away and we start to get a little bit hangry, we're like, oh, okay, I am a little bit more controlling than I realized, or whatever it is for you. But when we take those things away, we can actually see things that we can't, because we just go through our normal lives, and most of that stuff stays hidden from us because we're just going from one thing to the next without reflecting on it. And one of the things that we see whenever in the desert, in the wilderness, those words are the same in the scriptures, that the desert teaches by taking away, right? See how you do without food. See how you do without technology, and figure it out. We learn by taking away. But the beautiful thing about that is whenever we get rid of the inessential, we can focus on what's really essential. We can focus on the things that actually matter, and not just all the other things that pile up that we feel like we have to give our attention to because everyone else is, so apparently we have to so we can keep up. But we can focus on what's really essential. But we find ourselves in a place where that's really hard to do, because in a lot of ways we're plagued by complexity, and our lives are just growing more and more complex, and that complexity has little to do with the things that matter most. It's about all these other things that we feel like we have to tend to, and sometimes there are consequences if we don't tend to them, but they don't have to do usually with the things that matter most to us. And a lot of us are trying to live lives that are superhuman, literally going beyond what humans are actually able to do. We're trying to exceed those and go beyond them and to accomplish more than anyone's ever accomplished before, and to do all of those things. And we're growing more and more disconnected from the things that really make us human, from who we really are, who we were created to be in the beginning. And so we're really going to look at that. And whenever we went to the desert, whenever we went to the wilderness, we got to just live in simplicity. And so as I talked about last week, for the first more than 2 days, we didn't eat anything, and we hiked a lot, and we learned a lot about ourselves in that process. Eventually, we did get to eat. I showed you a photo of the banana. That was the best banana that I've ever eaten, hands down, after 54 hours of fasting and a lot of hiking. But after that, we came into what we called survival camp. And so we came to this beautiful meadow, and just in this big area we got to camp out. You can see just the beautiful trees. There were aspens and ponderosa pines. That's one of those on the right. And we actually this time we got shelter that we didn't have to build ourselves. And so that's called a wickiup. It's basically a bunch of large branches or tree trunks that are kind of stacked together, and then there's all kinds of brush to insulate. And it was still cold, but it was not as cold as we were without that. And so you can see there's not a door. The air is still flowing in and out. A few times I heard movement above me while I was trying to sleep, and some of the pine needles fell. So we had some friends who were also using the shelter. But it was nice to have something over our heads. But we were really focused during that phase. So after really the hard time, we got to rest, and we focused on kind of the longer-term priorities of survival, really learning to do a lot of the things that we needed to be able to do. And one of the things that I learned as we were going through that is how disconnected I am from where my food comes from. And because we got the banana at night, that was great. And then we went to bed, and that was probably okay, because after you fasted for a long time, eating a huge meal, not a great idea. Definitely leads to indigestion. The next morning, we got an apple, which was also great. Did you know if you fast for a long time and then you eat an apple, it burns your mouth? And so if you ever experience that, it's normal, apparently. For a while, I was like, okay, I'm in the wilderness, my mouth is, am I going to have like burns? Anyway, no, it was fine, just uncomfortable. And so we had that, but our next meal we found out was we were going to get meat, but it was still alive. And we were going to have to kill it and process it in order to be able to actually eat. And so they had a ram that they had bought, and one of us was going to have to actually kill it. And so they said no one was required to, but everyone could put their name into a hat if they wanted to. And so I thought about that. Is this something I want to do? And the answer was no, but I also knew that I was going to benefit from it. And so part of me thought, if I want to eat this, then I probably ought to be willing to actually do what's necessary to make that happen. And so I put my name in the hat, and they drew, and it was David and not Brandon. I was very relieved about that, right? I put my name in the hat, I did what I could, and it wasn't me. Okay. But it was really, really almost a holy moment that we approached this animal, and we were all surrounding it and had to actually hold it down, and we were there and holding it as it died. And being the closest that I had come from that, I grew up in the suburbs. That was not part of my upbringing. I know some people, if you grew up in the country, that was just part of it. But I saw my dad clean some fish, and that was about the closest I'd come. It was a different thing to be there at the death of a large mammal. And there were a lot of us, including me, who just had tears coming down of our face because it was such a moving experience. And so we went through that, and then after that we had to process it. And so if you've been deer hunting, and if you've successfully been deer hunting, then you've experienced this. But removing the hide and then actually kind of doing the cutting it up. And so that's really primarily what we ate for the next day in a lot of different ways. We ate a lot of different parts. I'll spare you the details, but anyway, we did not let it go to waste. And it was a really powerful experience of seeing what goes into it whenever I eat meat, because I do that pretty much every day. And yet for me, it comes in a plastic carton, right? But that's not where food comes from, not ultimately. And so really experiencing that was moving. And I can't say that I bring a bunch of mindfulness to every meal that I eat now, but whenever I think about it, it reminds me that there is a cost for me to be fed, for me to eat the things that I do. We also learned some things that were not quite so heavy. And so one of the tricks to staying warm in the backcountry is if you have a fire, you can get your water bottle and put it in the fire. Now, you don't want to let you want to do this if it's metal. If it's plastic, it'll melt. That's not great. But then you wrap it in a sock or something like that, and you can put it down by your feet, and it's a great way to keep your feet warm at night. If you've got a Nalgene water bottle, don't put that in the fire, but you can pour boiling water into it and use that to keep warm. And so that's another way to do that. We also learned how to make shelters out of ponchos, and so that's one that I made. That's a diamond shelter where you've got one end that's up and then the other three are down, and so we used paracord and then tied the other ends to bandanas and put rocks on the bandanas, and that's how we were able to make that happen. We also learned how to make lean-tos and A-frames, and so just depending on what you have and what's around you, you can do different kinds of shelters. But so that's what we slept in a few of the nights, and whenever we weren't doing the things that were crucial to survival, we got to do some luxurious things like laundry. And you can imagine after the amount of sweating we were doing that it needed to be done. And so what that looked like is we'd dig a hole, put a trash bag in it, and then pour water into it so the water didn't just immediately get absorbed by the soil. And then basically we had little things of Dr. Bronner's soap, if you've ever used that, great stuff. And we would just, put the clothes in, wring them out, and then wash them all, and then do the same, get clean water and do the same thing. I had to make multiple trips to the creek to do that, and so it took me 2 hours to do laundry. Whenever I'm at home and I complain about doing laundry, what I'm actually complaining about is folding clothes. I don't do laundry. I put them into a machine, and then I push a button, and that's it. That was not the case in the backcountry. It made me appreciate laundry machines so much more, but it was a lot of work just to get them done. Drying was easy. I just had to hang them up and wait, but if there was something that I needed to wear at night, then I was really hoping the sun would do its work quickly, and fortunately it did. But the other thing that we learned was how to make fire. We didn't have lighters, we didn't have anything like that, and so what we did have a lot of was sagebrush. It was everywhere, and one of the nice things about sagebrush is that whenever you break it off, the wood's already dry, and so it's not like some wood where you have to let it age and season before you can actually light a fire that won't just be really smoky. And so we were able to use that for fire. We also used that to make bow drills in order to make fires, and so that's one of the bushes up close, and you just break off a gnarled part, and it was also everywhere, and so we could harvest it without worrying about depleting it in the area. But one of the things that we had to make was a spindle, and so I started with a branch like that and kind of just with my knife whittled it down. Do you know what the most dangerous thing we encountered was, according to our instructors? It was our own knives, right? The most likely injury that we were going to suffer was cutting ourselves trying to carve things. And I made it out with no major injuries, only one dumb thing where I just poked myself a little bit. So that was good. But we had to create a spindle, and then we also created a hearth board. And so I started with a bigger branch like that, and then that's what the finished hearth board looks like. And so it's just kind of flat. I've actually got it here. I can show you some of the parts. But you would start with a branch, and then it would come into this kind of flat piece, and you'd make these little holes in it, and then you have notches in the side so that whenever it made a coal, it would fall out, and then you could take that and put it into a tinder nest in order to get the thing going. I have not enough hands to really show you all of this, but we used a bow, and so you'd take your spindle, and you'd wrap it in the bow, and then you'd place it in here, and then we had a rock, and you'd place that on top of the spindle to hold it in place for friction, and then you just start going back and forth. And it looks super easy, and it is not super easy. And this thing went flying more times than I can count, but eventually it worked, and we had fire. But it was something that we had to make, and so really the process, you can see this. This is double speed, so you're not sitting here all day. But we had to get the spindle and get it into the bow. And then you hold the rock down and have to get quite a bit of pressure on that in order to get the friction that you need to get a coal. And so then you just bow back and forth, and you hope that you will start to see smoke. And then whenever that happens, you have to keep going, because smoke does not mean you're done, although I was tempted to stop early a few times. And so you just keep going, and whenever the spindle goes flying, you pick it up again and start going. I'm also barefoot, not because I was, trying to be Tarzan or something, but you need to be able to have the tactile touch to be able to hold the hearth board. If you use a shoe, you won't be able to, it might just go sliding away because you can't be as precise with that. Eventually, you get a coal, and you blow on it a little bit, and then we used juniper bark for our tinder nests, and so you put that into the tinder nest and then blow until you see a flame. And so I also have a recording where this did not work at all, and I'm not going to show you that one because it looks like this without the smoke. But you keep blowing, and then you just wait and you hope for it to catch before the coal goes out. And a few times people in our group would have coals, and they would get into the nest, and it just wouldn't catch. And then you'd have to start all over. So fortunately, this time it did work, and eventually you see a flame. And so, yeah, it was pretty exciting. I felt really cool whenever I made a fire using a bow drill. And then I reminded myself, if you were in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you'd be as competent as a 4-year-old. Okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. I'll take it either way. So, really, it was just a lot of really simple things, like you have to get fire, you have to get water, you have to get food that were really hard. But it was simple, and we experienced the simplicity in the wilderness. And one of the stories that we see this in is in the story of Elijah. And so if you know the story of Elijah, he was coming at a time whenever the king and queen of Israel were worshiping other gods. The gods were worshiping Baal, which was a Canaanite fertility god. And so they had all of these prophets who were worshiping Baal, and they had kind of a showdown between Elijah, the prophet of God, and the prophets of Baal. And Elijah won, and he, for that reason and many others, he's regarded as one of the greatest prophets, second probably only to Moses. And if you remember the transfiguration story of Jesus, the two people who appear with him are Moses and Elijah. And so he has this showdown with the prophets of Baal, and he wins, and yet he's on the run for his life, because the queen says basically okay, you're dead. We're gonna get you. And so he's running for his life, and he's in total despair. And this is what it says in 1 Kings. It says, "Then Elijah, was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. 'It is enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors.'" And so, he's just he's just like, there's no point. Like, I think I've won this great victory, and they're still trying to kill me. That does not feel like victory. Like, what's the point? He was done. And God meets him where he is and provides for his most basic needs. And so he's at this tree. He's basically saying, God, what's the point? I'm done. And this is what happens. He lays down under a broom tree and falls asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. He looked there at his head, and at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. And so look how basic this is. Like, you would think, like, oh, Elijah needs like a supernatural healing of his spirit. And what does God give him? A nap, some food, and some water under the shade of a tree. And just really the most basic stuff. And so the angel comes to him a second time, touches him and says, get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. And so it's only after having met these basic needs that Elijah was ready to encounter God and to receive his instruction. And yet so often we're ready to just go on and take on the next thing whenever we haven't done that. Like, how many of you have tried to do way too much when what you really needed was a nap, right? I mean, we recognize it in children. We say, oh, somebody did not get enough sleep. And yet I know a lot of adults, I've been that adult, who needed a nap, and it was obvious to everyone, right? Just like not firing on all cylinders, not in the best mood. I'm not the best pastor whenever I'm tired. Any of you do your best work whenever you're exhausted? No, right? And we even got a word whenever you get too hungry. What are you? You're hangry, right? I mean, we need these really basic needs. And then after he has these things met, after he gets a nap, he gets to rest in the shade and he gets some food and water, then maybe you've heard this story before, but this is what the angel says, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. If you learn that growing up, and you may have heard the translation, a still small voice. That's that scripture. But he's got to have the basics taken care of before he can hear that. And the one thing that's been really interesting to me to learn is that whenever you go on a spiritual retreat, like your leaders will say, if you're tired, you need to take a nap, right? And you're like, no, I'm here. I'm going to read my Bible. I'm going to pray for like 3 hours. And like, no, you got to rest. Like, for that to be effective, you have to be rested. And so for Elijah, for him to be able to hear this word, for him to be able to hear God's voice in the sheer silence, to be able to hear the still small voice, he's got to rest, he's got to eat, and he's got to drink. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in our complex problems that we forget about the basics, right? We're up so late doing email and trying to catch up that we neglect sleep, which makes it so much better the next day because all of our email is answered and there's no more waiting for us when we wake up, right? No, that is not how email works. The more you send, the more you get. And if you clear the decks, you just get more. That's your reward. Congratulations, more email, right? That's how it works. And so if we neglect sleep, then not only do we have a pile of email waiting for us, but we're less rested and able to take care of it well. And so whenever we find ourselves stuck in the complexity of everyday life, we really have to find ways to reconnect with our humanity, to remember what it truly means to be human. And if you're a Christian, what that means for us is that we were created as part of God's good creation, made in the image of God. In the image of God, God created us. And this is how Genesis 2 tells it. Then the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. And so we are spiritual beings. We became living beings because of the breath of God. The Spirit of God breathed into us. But we're also made out of mud, right? And so anytime you're tempted to get too high and mighty, you might just remember I'm made out of mud, from the dust of the ground. Like, from dust you have come, and to dust you shall return. And we have to be reminded that we're not separate from the earth. It's a part of who we are. It's where we come from. And it's really easy today whenever we live in worlds of screens and air conditioning and buildings that are totally sealed so you can keep the hot air from getting in. And don't get me wrong, I love that. I depend on that during the summer. But it's easy to forget that actually outdoors, nature, that's where we come from. We don't come from indoors. That's not, that maybe was where we were born, but it's not the environment that we were created for. And whenever we encounter those really basic needs, our daily need for food and water and air, they remind us of our dependence on God and on the earth for life, our dependence on God and the world that God created. We're totally dependent, and we can't escape that. And if you go out into the wilderness and don't take enough water, you're quickly reminded, like, oh, I am dependent on this, and I'm going to be in trouble if I don't find more. And not only that, but we can recognize the gift that we have in creation. And every time we have a meal, we can remember that everything we eat is a gift from another creature. And if you're eating meat, then something literally had to give its life for you to be able to eat that. And just to recognize that is a part of what it means to sit down and to eat. And even if it's not something that even if it's, vegetable or grain, you're still getting that benefit from another thing that God created, from another creature. And so all of that, we have this, in our very biology, we're connected to the world that God has made. And we lose a part of ourselves whenever we get disconnected from creation. Whenever we lose that, whenever we think we're just indoor beings, whenever we're, I was trying to think of a clever play on Homo sapiens that replaced sapiens with screens. It's just not there. If you know it, let me know outside and I'll add it for 10:45. But there's so much more to life than what's on our screens. And yet, where do we spend the vast majority of every day now? On screens. And there's so much more to that. We're part of this amazing world that God has created and let us be part of and entrusted us with. This is how Adele Calhoun puts it. She says, this world belongs to the Creator, and it is ours only in trust and by divine delegation. It's not just a bunch of resources that we can use however we want at our disposal, but God's trusted us with it. And being out in the wilderness reminds me, I want my children and their children and other people's children to be able to experience that as well. And that's what we read in the Psalms as well. As we read at the very beginning, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it, for he founded it on the seas and established it on the river. Every place that we walk, even our own yards that we think that we own, or maybe we own, I think I own my yard, the bank actually owns most of it, but it's not mine, it's God's, and I'm holding it in trust. And maybe I've got plans for where that tree is, but it might be that God has plans for that tree that supersede my plans. Like, Brandon, you don't need a pool. You actually don't have space for it, and you don't need to do that. Besides, this tree is providing shade and some nesting for birds that I really care about. And we've got to take that matters as well. And so there may be things that God has in store that aren't just our plans, because the world is not ours. It's God's. And we experience this connection, we know it, because whenever we're outside, we experience mental, physical, and spiritual benefits. And there are some really interesting studies about that I won't go into, but you've experienced that, right? I mean, whenever you've been cooped up outside and you walk out and you see a sunset, that's restorative in a way that's not just the relief of seeing something pretty, right? It connects at a deeper level. We experience that. And so that's one of the ways that we can really experience more simple lives, is just connecting with the world that we're a part of, that we were created to inhabit. That's one of the ways that we can seek simplicity. And if we really want to connect with our humanity, we've got to find ways to simplify our lives. And simplicity is actually a spiritual discipline. Did you know that? It's like, wow, I thought that was just like a Marie Kondo thing, and we just got to get rid of all the stuff we don't use, and does this spark joy? No, okay. No, it actually is much deeper than that. I don't know, maybe she knows that, but I didn't. And this is what Adele Calhoun says. She's got a book called The Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. I was going to tell you how great the book is, and I thought, you might be a pastor if you think everybody needs to read a Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. Anyway, I've got it. You're welcome to read it, and maybe even borrow it if I'm feeling generous. But this is what she says about the discipline of simplicity. She says, Jesus wants us to know that we don't need all the things or experiences that we think we do. Did you hear that? I'll say that again. Jesus wants us to know we do not need all the things or experiences that we think we do. We don't need them. What we really need is to keep first things first, Jesus and his kingdom. Life becomes much more simple when one thing matters most. And so one of the keys to simplicity is just to, basically to remember what Stephen Covey said, which is really a distillation of what the scriptures say, is to keep first things first. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God and its righteousness, and all the other things will take care of themselves. And so the way that we do that, we recognize we can do all the outward practices. Simplicity is actually an inner disposition as well as an outward practice, and you need both of them. You can do all the outward stuff, but if you don't take care of the inner stuff, you're not actually going to live more simply. You're just going to be manic about your decluttering. And so we need both. We need both. Because if you got the inner stuff and you don't take care of the outer stuff, then what good's the inner stuff doing for you? And so we need both of those. And we can start by assessing our relationships with creation, like we've been talking about, with technology, which we did a whole sermon series about last fall. It's What the Tech. It was a great series. If you need to revisit that, probably most of us could. And then the other thing is just our stuff. Our stuff. We have so much stuff. I mean, I have more in one closet probably than my great-grandparents owned their entire lives, right? I mean, it's crazy. But Richard Foster talks about 3 attitudes that can help us to lead to this inward reality of simplicity. And so the way that he says that, these are his words, he says, to receive what we have as a gift from God. Not to see it as just our stuff or something that we've earned or something, but everything that we have as a gift of God. And so whenever we do things like laundry and recognize that, my ancestors had this thing called a washboard and had to really scrub stuff, and I have to do this. That's okay, I've got to pour some detergent, but then I hit a button and it's done for me. That's a gift. And drying is the same. And washing dishes, right? Oh, I've got to do dishes. What does that mean? For most of them, it means I've got to get the big stuff off and put it into a dishwasher. And that is a gift. Water that we don't have to purify, that's a miracle to most of the humans who have ever lived. All of these things are gifts. And most of the time, we don't recognize it as such. It's just stuff. It's just part of being alive. And so we can take that and everything that we have to know that it's a gift from God. The second thing is to know that it's God's business and not ours to care for what we have. It's God's business and not ours. Now, I'm not saying just leave your stuff laying around and hope nothing happens to it. I'm not saying don't lock your doors. That's still a good thing to do, but ultimately there's nothing that we can do that's ultimately going to protect our stuff, right? I can do what I can do, but unless I live in a steel cube, probably there's still ways that people can get into my house if they want to take my stuff. And that's just the reality. I have to learn to let go of that and just say, I've got this stuff, and I'm not the ultimate protector of it. That's not mine. That's a bigger job than I have to do. And that helps me also to be detached from it as well. Okay, that's unfortunate. I like that thing, and it's gone now, and I've got to deal with that. And then the third attitude that he talks about is to have our goods available for others. Okay, I know no one's excited about this one. I get it as well. I've loaned people books, and they did not come back. And if you know me, that's the most precious thing that I could loan you, especially if I've underlined in it. And and that just happens. Sometimes it happens, and that stuff is hard. And there's stuff that we don't want to share with other people. And I'm not saying loan people your wedding ring, right? There's some things probably that aren't useful. My fingers are tiny, so probably you can't wear my wedding ring anyway. But we have to hold our stuff in open hands if we're not going to be owned by it, right? If I've got to protect this at all costs and I'm not going to let anyone use this, then what's actually the most important thing in my life? I'm protecting my stuff. And so we have to be able to let go of that, to actually be able to use it, to enjoy it, but to recognize it's not ours. And being open to sharing is one way that we can do that. And yeah, if you share stuff, sometimes it won't come back. Sometimes it'll come back in condition that's worse than you had it, but at the end of the day, it's stuff. It's stuff. And so here's some action steps that I want to challenge you to do with me this week. And the first one is just recognizing that everything you eat is a gift. And so before meals, pause and think through all that went into your meal and give thanks. Give thanks for, if you're having hamburgers, give thanks for the cow that gave its life so that you could eat. for the person who farmed the potatoes that are making your French fries, whatever that is, the people who served you, all of those things, because by the time it gets to us, there's so many people who have had a hand in getting the food to us, and it's really a gift. Every step of the way is a gift. So as you do that, many of us say prayers before we eat, but actually give thanks for all that went into it, because everything that we eat is a gift. I also want to challenge you, this one will be tough, I want to challenge you to give something away that is valuable to you, that is valuable. Now, I'm not talking about grandma's china, although from what I've heard, you can't hardly give china away anymore. I'm not talking about your watch that was your grandfather's or whatever that is, but I am saying give something away that's not the pair of pants that's been in your closet for 4 years and you really need the space anyway, right? And this is just a way of helping us to see that our stuff does not own us. And so something that you'd want to hold on to, or maybe something that you'd prefer just to sell so you can at least get something from it, if it has value to you, whether that's sentimental or monetary, give that away. And as you do that, you can offer a prayer and say, God, help me not to be so attached to my stuff that it begins to own me. Help me to simplify so that I can fully enjoy you. And let that practice help you to let go of your attachment to things. I think most of us need some help with that today. And then I want to challenge you just to spend some time outside each day this week. I think, is the weather better this week? A little bit cooler, and so it's a great way to do that. But if not, first thing in the morning is a great time. Yesterday, I went outside and just sat for like an hour and prayed and read my Bible, and my favorite way to start my day. And so spend time outside. Remember that you're a creature of this world that God made, and that God has blessed us to be able to dwell in it. And everything that we have and everything we get to experience is a gift from the Creator. Will you pray with me? God, we are thankful for this world that you've created that is so wonderful and amazing, and we thank you for our part in it. And we pray that you would help us whenever things get really complex to set aside all the things that are taking us away from you, and to be able to actually seek you, to seek first your kingdom, and to care for the people that you've given us to care for, and let the other things take care of themselves. Help us to follow your Son's example as he sought you above all else, as he sacrificed himself for the sake of others, and as he taught us even how to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.